Got you.
You just have the bell. We're going to stop. The unsurpassed wondrous Dharma is rarely met with 100,000 million dollars. Now we can see it, hear it, accept and maintain it. May we unfold the meaning of it to God as truth. I almost chanted the closing verse. Time to go.
Great BohdiDharma.
I was once attending at Okamura Roshi's place in Bloomington, and I was supposed to lead the thing. I started chanting the wrong one. I started doing the karma, and his talk was about karma, so it was like psychic, right? So today we're talking about BohdiDharma. He's half, I guess, apocryphal or something figure. They're not. We think the stories about him may be combinations. What's that called when you one individual comes to represent maybe more than one in philosophy or history? There's a name for it.
Composite.
A composite figure. Thank you. Pass this around. Tom, you may be able to read this. I can't read it. Or Joe, you may be able to read it and tell us what that says. The inscription. This is one that when we first decided to move here from a little place in Candler Park, the whole room we had, the one room we had, wasn't as big as this room. And then we had a bathroom and there was a jewelry store. So we were kind of limited in what we could do. Around 2000, we decided to move here. So you get one of these and it has a blank eyes, and you paint one in. And everybody takes a turn, so you paint a little circle in the middle, somebody else paints another one, another, until you fill it in. You leave the other one blank until you move in or get whatever that project was that you were going to do until you get the project done. Then in the ceremony, you fill in the second eye, and it's done. So that one marked our transition over here. This, one day I was walking down the street in my neighborhood, and you know what a bollard is? Like a big pipe that filled with concrete so you can't drive into a lawn. Right, there were some bollards on an apartment lawn out there, and he was sitting right there on top of one of them.
Really?
So, you're coming home with me. So looking at this, it looks to me like it may be, it's almost like Douglas fir, and you can see it's cracking, which is typical of Douglas fir. And it was turned, obviously on a lathe to get the general shape, and then they carved the rest of it. If you look at the wooden fish drum over there, you can see a masterpiece of carving. They had to, I don't know how they do those. They've got people sitting there day in and day out making those things. If you've ever worked with wood, if you've ever done any hands-on kind of thing, you understand how difficult these things are to do. Interesting thing about the grain here is, if I pass this around, notice how it makes rings around his nose. So that's a found BohdiDharma. Story of the big eyes has to do with tea. According to legend, BohdiDharma also brought tea from India to China. And that was the introduction of tea to China. That's hard to believe, right? I mean, you'd think everybody discovers tea sooner or later in their own neighborhood. But then England, the tea company took, that was one of the big rip-offs in history that we're all familiar with. So maybe not. The story goes, he kept falling asleep while he was trying to do meditation. And so he got frustrated with that and cut his eyelids off, threw them on the ground. That's why he's always represented with these big eyes. And the eyelids turned black, right, and curled. like a tea leaf. That's what a tea leaf looks like. Looks like Bodhidharma's eyelids cut off. And then from where he'll never drink tea again, right? From where he threw the tea leaves down, the legend goes that's where the first tea bushes sprung up in China. And that's how now all the monks, as David was saying, all the monks drink tea to be alert. And I guess it had to get to Japan before they got to the matcha point, huh? Refinement.
Well, it started in China.
It started in China?
But it didn't get as weaponized. It didn't become, because China still does tea in regions.
Yeah.
Japan blends the tea.
Okay.
Which are Japanese blend the tea.
Uh-huh.
And matcha is a different strain than what you have every day.
And it's the very fresh, early green tea, and it's ground up, so you have the whole leaf powdered.
It's shade grown. So that they
Shade grown.
They put the shade over it about 6 or 8 weeks before, I think, something like that, depending on the region. And that makes the chlorophyll that really strives to get that sunlight, and it makes it really bright green. And they grind it after they steam it.
Yep. I've seen the videos of that. Consequently, when you drink it, you got the whole deal there. It's not filtered at all.
It's a food at this point.
Yep. So Bodhidharma is the stuff of legend. There are, if you, a good source book for you to read. One is, I always recommend anybody who's interested in Zen, Buddhism, and so forth, get a copy of the Shambhala Dictionary of Buddhism and Zen. It's just basic, like a basic text. And it has a wonderful thing about it that when you read one definition, and by the way, David here, oh, you brought it, good. David here is a Chinese medicine herbal person and acupuncturist, so he knows from herbs and tea, as does Sensei. So this is always a good place to start. You know, if you're interested in somebody like we did Nagarjuna last month. Nagarjuna was 14th in India. If you think of Buddha here, and Nagarjuna is 14th, and Bodhidharma is 28th. So Nagarjuna was halfway through. And then the legend goes that Bodhidharma brought this direct practice of meditation to China, where Buddhism had been there for many years in the forms of decades or centuries, probably four centuries or so, in the form of written scrolls and so forth that have been. It's much easier to transmit written work than it is to transmit direct practice, which requires face-to-face training. So the actual transmission of Zen training lags behind the dispersion of Buddha Dharma in its history. And there are stories of Chinese monks who preceded Bodhidharma. One was very famous, who were actually Zen monks. And so it's just as we claim an unbroken lineage from Shakyamuni Buddha on down to our teacher. When you read the history, you see there's a bunch of dog legs and breaks in there. It isn't. There was one point at which the Soto master, the patriarch, was in his 80s, and his only student was in his 80s. And his student died. So he went to a young Rinzai master, very famous at the time, and transmitted the Soto teaching to this Rinzai master and asked him to transmit it to a worthy vessel at some point in the future. And so at some point he did, and that's how that dog leg is in the lineage, where it went off and was Rinzai in keeping for a while, and then it was transmitted. And it always brought up the question for me, how did he choose this one out of all of his students to get the Soto instead of the Rinzai? How would you do that? I asked Okamura Roshi about it, and I said, this is the only successor he shows on the chart. And he said, no, he had another dozen or so Rinzai successors. So a lot of this, our myths about this are lost. They're lost to our ability to track it down and find it. But you can go back to people from Japan and China this stuff is all on paper. I mean, it's amazing what's there. It hasn't been translated. So there are a lot of weird anomalies like that that I really appreciate in the history. So this is always a good place to start. And I can't remember who's on for next month, who the ancestor is. Sensei Matsuoka Roshi is always in November. That's the month he was born and died. And
The guest lecture first weekend of April is going to be on Wen Ying.
going to be on what?
Wen Ying.
Well, maybe he's the one. He was the sixth patriarch in China.
Yeah.
We call this series Monsters of Zen. In jazz, I grew up in a jazz family. Some of you know my dad had a jazz band in the 40s, and my brother was an outstanding jazz pianist and musician kind of person. Never became really famous, but he was famous in jazz circles. And they'd call Charlie Parker, Thelonious Monk, Bill Evans monsters. You know, they were so good they're scary. So the monsters of Zen include BohdiDharma, Dogen, and Huineng, certainly. So here's the picture, and I'm just going to read briefly from here. It goes on, and this is a very long entry, so you can look this up and read the rest of it. It's a very important figure. 28th patriarch after Shakyamuni Buddha in Indian lineage, and the first Chinese patriarch of Chan, which means Zen. Chan is phonetic for jhana. Jhana is contemplation in Sanskrit. Chan is phonetic for that, and Zen is phonetic for Chan. But what BohdiDharma was doing, sitting in his cave in China, was not jhana. So Zen is actually a misnomer. It's not the right word. The pundits who would come to meet BohdiDharma and interview him, he would spin around and face the wall, turn his back on him, like rude, right? And so they thought he was doing wall contemplation, wall gazing Zen, contemplating this mountain wall, which was a cliff in a cave where he at Shaolin. There's a real Shaolin, like Kung Fu, right? Remember the television series? There's a real Shaolin called Shorinji in Japanese, and BohdiDharma was actually there. And legend goes that he did teach the monks how to do open hand fighting, karate. He taught them to imitate the birds and the snakes, and he taught them to watch how the animals fight and learn to fight that way. So according to one of our students who heads up a temple in Dothan, Alabama, Frederick Lecoute, he's a Frenchman who's also a martial arts teacher. He said in martial arts, they think this is all true. All true. So he was also the teacher of Huike, whom he installed as the second patriarch of Zen in China. So the patriarchy in China starts with BohdiDharma as the first, just as in India starts with Shakyamuni as the first. But Shakyamuni is not really a patriarch, he's the founder. He had no teacher. Everybody after Shakyamuni had a teacher. This is why Shakyamuni is so highly revered, because he discovered this on his own without benefit of having a teacher. He had lots of teachers, but they didn't teach this, right? So once the 27th patriarch, the Venerable Hanyatara, who was BohdiDharma's teacher, asked, among all things, what is formless? The master BohdiDharma said, non-arising is formless. Patriarch said, among all things, what is the biggest? The master said, the nature of Dharma is the biggest. So after BohdiDharma was confirmed by Prajnathara as the 28th patriarch, according to tradition, he traveled by ship from India to South China, which was a hazardous journey in those days. Later, Dogen went to China from Japan. It was the same thing, very hazardous journey. You're taking your life in your hands. After a brief, unsuccessful attempt to spread his teachings there in China, southern China, he wandered further to Luoyang in North China and finally settled at the Shaolin Monastery on Songshan, or Susan Mountain. Here he practiced unmovable zazen for 9 years, on which account this period is known as Menpeki Kunen, which roughly means 9 years in front of the law. And when we say, Shakyamuni practiced zazen for 6 years, and Huineng, or BohdiDharma, for 9 years, which is recounted in Dogen's Fukan Zazengi, his tract on meditation, They didn't get up and watch TV every once in a while. They sat or turn on a light. You know, they had to go down to the stream to do their thing. But so anyway, here Huike, later the second patriarch of Zen in China, found his way to the master after an impressive proof of his will for the truth was accepted as his disciple. So this mindfulness bell we take from Thich Nhat Hanh, it makes us slow down, stop for a minute, take a few breaths. Remember that what we're discussing is not some fantasy. It's about this reality we're sitting in the middle of. So Huike is the famous for cutting his arm off to show his sincerity. You know how exaggerated this story is. It's not meant to glamorize cutting yourself. So then it goes on and tells much of his story. I do want to read the way he left his disciples finally and returned to India, according to the legend. It is not certain whether he died there at Shaolin or again left the monastery after he had transmitted the patriarchy to Huike. According to a legend given in the something Chinese document, after 9 years at Shaolin Monastery, he became homesick for India and decided to return there. Fully enlightened master is homesick. Let that be a lesson to you. Before departing, he called his disciples to him in order to test their realization. The first disciple he questioned answered, "The way I understand it, if we want to realize the truth, we should neither depend entirely on words nor entirely do away with words. Rather, we should use them as a tool on the way." BohdiDharma answered him, "You have grasped my skin." The next to come forward was a nun who said, "As I understand it, the truth is an auspicious display of the Buddha paradise. One sees it once, then never again." To her, BohdiDharma replied, "You have grasped my flesh." The next disciple said, "The four great elements are empty, and the five skandhas, form, feeling, thought, impulse, consciousness, are non-existent. There is, in fact, nothing to grasp." To this, BohdiDharma responded, "You have grasped my bones." Finally, it was Huike's turn. He, however, said nothing, only bowed to the master in silence. To him, BohdiDharma said, "You have grasped my marrow." So this is often taken, this story, and there's many more stories around BohdiDharma, is taken to mean that Huike, who was his successor, at least historically on the chart, who knows what happened to the other three, they're probably recounted somewhere, because BohdiDharma's advent there was recorded and is written on paper, documents going back to close to those times anyway. Zen's Chinese Heritage is another sort of text that you might want to look into if you're interested in where Soto Zen came from. It has all the Rinzai teachers in there as well, but it's the lineage from teacher to disciple all the way down, starting with Shakyamuni, then BohdiDharma in China, and then BohdiDharma in China, really. So I think it recaps the Indian lineage, but then all the way down to Dogen, who went to China, and Yojo, his teacher, is where he had his first profound insight. So he basically carried back to Japan a Chinese form of practice, which is what we're practicing today. That's where our lineage comes from. If that Zen's Chinese Heritage is another kind of foundational text in English, and Gary Ferguson wrote it. He went to China and investigated all this, and he claims that all these records are there. That you can find them. They can be pulled out and read. It's amazing when we think of how quickly CDs went away, right? Or how quickly audio tape, micro cassettes. This stuff is still there, and it's still working pretty well. So any questions so far?
What was between what was already in China at the time and the difference between what was it that BohdiDharma brought to China that was distinct from the Buddhism that was already being practiced there?
Well, other than the exceptions that I mentioned, there was a famous monk that apparently was teaching this form of practice, and became well enough known that he's recorded in history, but is not, as far as I know, he's not included in the formal lineage. We have lineage documents that show teacher to student all the way down, and when you become a priest, you make out those documents yourself and you put your own lineage in and all that stuff. Painting on silk is quite a trick. So it's part of the formal practice. But mostly what was in China at the time, China was, Confucianism, Taoism. They didn't need no stinking Buddhism. They had plenty of stuff, to work with. So it had become, it probably was a scholarly pursuit of translation, translating from Sanskrit, to Chinese and so forth. And many of the documents we have today are completely lost in Sanskrit. It's way too old. Many of the things we call sutras from India are actually only extant in the form of a Chinese document, a document in Chinese. So their scholarship, and these guys were not pikers. I mean, they were amazing. And we were traveling to India, traveling back to China, back and forth. Somebody who's into philosophy, history around this can tell you, massive amounts of information around that. And the Silk Road was very active, so there was a lot more commerce and trade and interaction than we think, but it was all on a scholarly level. The transmission, what we call the transmission of Zen, is face to face from teacher to student, right?
Yes.
And it's not done by mailing you a certificate, although that was done once. There was a Japanese guy sent his monks to China, his students, and they convinced a Chinese teacher that their teacher, who didn't bother to come, is back in Japan, was the real thing. So he was so impressed with them that he actually gave them the certificates to take back to Japan to give to their teacher.
First mail order.
First email ordination. And today we do Jukai by Skype. We do the first initiation ceremony, first 5 precepts, do by Skype. So, but he brought that tradition, and Huike was Chinese, was his first student, and these other 3, they were all Chinese. So that's where this direct practice, face-to-face transmission, was implanted in China.
Okay.
That makes sense? Okay. Anybody else? Anything else? Okay. Moving right along. And you're keeping time, right? Is it every 15 that you're doing?
Yes.
Okay, good. So this is a book you can buy here. They're $15. These are the later talks of Matsuoka Roshi. Second volume of Matsuoka Roshi's Teaching Archives. We have another one which is not, we're out of, but can be ordered through the website. And in here he talks about BohdiDharma. There's an index at the back, so it's easy to kind of track places where anybody you're interested in, any teacher you're following or whatever is mentioned. And his first mention is in Exposition of Zen. This is the section heading. I actually put this collection together myself because Sensei had died before we had all these. We found these when we gathered all the other ones in the early volume called the Kyosaku, after the stick, this stick that we use on posture correction, striking shoulders, called Kyosaku. Much bigger volume. He had organized that himself. So when we found all these other talks, I organized them in a similar way. The first section is the Exposition of Zen. The first one is called Jnana Yana. Jnana means contemplation, and Yana means way amongst the ways. So it's a way amongst the ways. So what he's doing in here is a practical guide on the ways of Zen. This was given at Komazawa Zen University in 1985. Komazawa's where we visited in 2 years ago, where Sensei was a student there and studied under the famous Kodo Sawaki Roshi, and we practiced in that same meditation hall. So the first place this is mentioned is in the very first section, and he's talking about how Soen Shaku came over in 1893, and that was the first introduction. And he's leading you through kind of the history in a very, this is one of his most scholarly pieces. Most of these were given as talks during the intermission when we'd been sitting for 40 minutes at the temple. Then we'd put our legs up and continue facing the wall. If he didn't give a talk, we'd do walking meditation sometimes, but he'd have us continue sitting facing the wall and he'd give a talk. So most of them are only about 20 minutes long or something like that, so they're not very long. This one goes on and on. It was given at the university. So Zen first gained a popular foothold in the cultural life of the United States a half century after Soen Shaku's visit. Some of the intellectuals at the time, among the circle of beat poets and authors, Zen became something of a philosophical fancy. It's portrayed in Jack Kerouac's book On the Road as a philosophical motif in the dialogue of a group of itinerants against the background of their personal drama. we know what he means, and social commentary. And for the beat generation of the 50s, Zen was used as nothing more than a justification for new or non-conventional behavior. This was called beat Zen. It was never really a school of Zen, as are Rinzai and Soto, both of which are founded in a tradition of serious practice. Nonetheless, beat Zen did much to focus popular and literary attention towards Zen, as did the writings of Dr. Daisetsu Suzuki, disciple of Soen Shaku Roshi. And Sensei was Matsuoka Roshi was a student of Daisetsu Suzuki at Columbia University. And so from the ensuing popular discussion of Zen without direct experience, Americans created a mystique around Zen. Here's a sampling of some of the terms they used: complete freedom, enlightenment, satori, insight, awakening, kensho, and liberation, nirvana, shunyata, emptiness, mu, the void, finger pointing to the moon, tathata, suchness, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, jhana, chan, Zen, Vinaya, discipline, zazen, kingen, sesshin, and sutras, yosaku, katsu, kana, koan, and mondo, tanden, ki, martial arts, way of peace, and the Zen ways, oneness, duality, three requisites of Zen study, the four noble truths, the five skandhas, the six paramitas, the eightfold noble path, and the 10 ox-herding pictures, Jukai, Tokudo, Unsui, Roshi, transmission, Inka, and Zenchi, Shakyamuni Buddha, Mahakashapa, Ananda, Nagarjuna, BohdiDharma. There it is. Okay. Huinang, Matsu, Lenshi, Chao Chan, Zhongshan, Wangpo, Eisai, Dogen, Basho, Ingen, and Hakuin. These are all names used in connection with the culture of Zen. Most of them come from India, China, and Japan. What they mean depends on who explained them to you, or whether you learned them directly from your own experience and found a word to describe it later, which is our approach, right? We're backward. I don't even want to attempt to explain all of them now, but I do want to shed some light on the practice of the three modern sects. Then he goes into Rinzai, Obaku, and Soto. So he mentions BohdiDharma, the 28th successor to Gautama Buddha and the first Chinese patriarch, describes the characteristics of Zen study as, and here's a quote, a special transmission outside the sutras, no dependence on words and learning, direct pointing to the mind of man, seeing your real nature and living enlightenment. So this is his own translation. You probably won't find this someplace else. For most of us, the chaos of this age of industrial progress, remember this was in 1985, for most of us, he's speaking at Komazawa in Japan, the chaos of this age of industrial progress, global economic and military turbulence, likely nuclear disaster from power plants or bombs, rapid erosion of the Earth's resources, the unbalancing of environmental patterns, unbalancing in its turn terrestrial life, and finally blinding rapid social change. Does this sound like yesterday? It's too much for us to handle in a balanced way. Our minds and emotions are not simple, but rather are confused, conditioned, and cluttered, not only by our common human condition, but more so by the accelerated turmoil of our time. So I've always thought it was an outstanding trait of Matsuoka Roshi, as well as most of the early Japanese, to be so eloquent in English. It's a second language. you imagine going to Japan and trying to teach Zen in Japanese? Joe could do it maybe, but for the rest of us, I mean, so anyway, I'm very impressed by that. Always have been. So then he mentions BohdiDharma once again. There's several other mentions in here that I'm not going to go into. He says, I would like to, he talks about, even though in a little while I would discuss the various jnana or Zen vehicles as a guide to learning Zen, I warn you not to rely only on a particular human tradition or a name alone as an emblem of true transmission of wisdom. There are lazy, self-important, and indulgent priests who do possess the, quote, right, close quote, credentials, but not because they have penetrated to the core of life and death, but because they are clever in a worldly sense. Absolutely, you cannot trust them. We hope present company accepted, and he's not talking about himself, we hope. It would be disastrous emotionally and mentally to do so, and yet you can find this sort in Zen centers throughout the United States and Asia, urging those who are confused and lack conviction to seek the ultimate freedom and pay the proper tribute. Or pay the proper tribute first, then seek the meaning of enlightenment later. You don't have to sugarcoat it for us, Sensei. Seek rather a teacher of genuine understanding, someone who may have a known name and high rank, but who may not have neither. Or should you simply judge a teacher by the number of disciples and students gathered around in what appear to be prosperous circumstances? Judge rather by the nature and perseverance of the Zen practice of that teacher, and so on. So then he said, I would like to discuss something about what your predecessors in the Sangha or group of Zen practitioners have found to be deceptive and effective throughout the history of Zen. Actually, history is the first great deceiver, or at least the little bit we know about history. Just as the finger pointing to the moon does not reveal the moon of enlightenment, neither is the record of history anything like the real experience. The common story as it goes is that Zen was handed down from Shakyamuni Buddha to Mahakashyapa, and from Mahakashyapa to Ananda, and so on to BohdiDharma, and so on to Dogen, and so on to the present. It is true that there is this heart-to-heart transmission, but it is a romantic fallacy that there has been only one person in each generation since the death of Gautama Buddha who has carried the Zen flame of wisdom, who in turn taught and transmitted it to the next generation. Perhaps history is right in recording that when Mahakashyapa beheld the golden flower held aloft by the Buddha silently, that was the first complete transmission of the incomparable wisdom. But the historical Buddha had many disciples, many of whom were very able. So he goes on to explain that they're not all known and lost to history. There have to be many, for there to be this many recorded in history. It's about 100 in each lineage. There had to be many, thousands and thousands who weren't are not even mentioned. So he says this great thing. Perhaps we will have to employ an army of psychics to reconstruct what actually happened in the history of the transmission of Zen. Or maybe we can just look at what is going on today that is similar. There are many teachers and many, many more students in any single generation. Just look at Zen in our own time in all the United States, and so on. So he goes on to make the point that by far the largest cohort of people who begin practice are those who quit too soon. Stop, Americans in particular. They start, doesn't seem to be their cup of tea, I'm not enlightened yet, and so they quit and move on to something else.
Or worse, I don't need this anymore.
That's right. So, again, let me stop there and see if anybody has any comment or question before we move on.
On the one hand, there seems to be a tradition of that kind of, I'm not sure, heretical or boldness among Zen teachers. But I wonder, though, was Matsuoka more so than most? I know that he was very outspoken and maybe rubbed Sotoshu, kind of the powers that be.
Yeah, sure he did. A lot of them did, a lot of the early guys. And but Sotoshu in Japan, we call it in business, in consulting, research, and design, for business, we call it the dead hand of management.
Yeah.
You go to these large corporations like, General Electric, Sunbeam, or, Kimberly-Clark, and you see all these designer types with glazed over eyes because they've been shot down so many times. Their ideas are tested and killed. And so in Japan, there are 18,000 Soto temples. 18,000. It's like bigger than 7-Eleven. they're on every corner, And so the guys go off to train the big monasteries, come back and do what they can to bring that back to their little shop on the corner, right? So he said Zen is dead in Japan. It just ossified. It got so huge, and that the institution sort of set into place, and he had no interest in establishing another institution in this country. He was more interested in those of us who just want to practice the meditation, right? He wasn't interested in being a temple priest, so he wasn't a temple priest. He wasn't popular with the Japanese community. That answer? Pretty good. Anybody else? Anything else?
I suppose, I'm in college, right? I sat with a meditative group and, had several meditation sessions. But I suppose, no, sorry, I'll speak up. I suppose the sort of the attraction, right? I was like, okay, I'm going to go to the actual lineage today. But then again, what you're saying is that that's not necessarily the thing, right?
The lineage is real, we think. It's meaningful. There are styles of practice handed down. There are techniques that are developed. There's a wonderful poem. One of the phrases stanzas in the poem says, now there is sudden and gradual, which was a big theoretical split in the schools in China, sudden school and gradual. Now there is sudden and gradual in which teachings and approaches arise. With teachings and approaches distinguished, each has its standards. Whether teachings and approaches are mastered or not, reality constantly flows. So
Who is that?
that's, I think that's Xing Xing Ming. I think that's Faith Mind. Sung San, third patriarch, I think. So what Zen is pointing at is the reality that's constantly flowing. The forms that it takes. I'm not throwing anything away. I don't have to wear this weird outfit. It's not for me. You come to Zen, you expect it to look like Zen. So sure enough, we costume up and we suit up and we set the stage, and it looks like Zen. So
I think that, to me, that that independent view that Matsuoka had made very appealing to Americans about this one.
I'm glad you brought me back to that, because what I wanted to say is, and I lost it, is he's in a distinct class, in my view. He's like BohdiDharma. He's like Soen Shaku. Sensei said his mother told him, go die in America, which is what he did, what he ended up doing. He left there in 1939 before the war. So he came over here, got interned in the camps, and then was let out of the camps. There's a whole history there. He was neither Japanese nor American, finally. He was like a man without a country. He was bridging cultures, and he was known as a bridge builder. Zen can bridge East and West as a title of 2 of his talks. He was always promoting us to Japan, promoting Japan to us, both before and after the war. So he was iconoclastic. He stood out, very different. But you think of the ones in history, Buddha, this founder, discovered this, and I call it the original frontier. It's the name of the manuscript I'm working on. He discovered this on his own in India. Then BohdiDharma carries it to China, right? Dogen goes back to China and carries it to Japan. And there are many, many more. I mean, it's not, as he's saying here, there's not, history is the great deceiver. There's not just one, right? But the ones that have the most impact get recorded. And if you go to Eiji Dogen's monastery in Japan, it's a mind blower. It's unbelievable what these people were able to do with hand tools. Just building these buildings alone was a monstrous accomplishment. And then Matsuoka comes to the US from Japan. So I think he's in the class of Dogen and BohdiDharma and Eisai, who went to China and brought Renzai back to Japan in the generation before Dogen. These are unusual characters, you know, that made this leap, you know, into a totally different culture, totally different language, totally different place in the world to bring this practice.
The thing that they all seem to have in common to me is the emphasis on practice as opposed to studying and reading. And beginner's night, I mean, one of the recurring things that happens is we have a lot of people, well, I've read all of this and I've been sitting on my own. I was like, well, now you might be ready to get started, you know. Because I think, you know, studying Zen without practicing Zen is about the same thing as saying that you've become a master baker because you ate a bag of cinnamon rolls. You know, it's really about the practice. Yeah. I mean, I think you would get a lot more traction by practicing and never reading a single book than the other way around.
Sensei warned about book knowledge. In the 60s, you could literally read everything that was published in English on Zen. It takes some time, but you could do it. And but he said people get the impression that because they've read all this stuff about Zen, they know Zen. They know about Zen. I actually had a colleague at the Art Institute of Chicago. He was a painting professor, and I mentioned Zen to him one day, and he said, "Oh, I know all about Zen. I read all about Zen. I know all about it." So it's a mindset that we have, and my way of thinking about it is like the documentation you used to get with software. You know, if you just read the books, it didn't make any sense, right? You had to sit down at the computer, you know, fire it up and get in there and run into a glitch, and then you could turn to the documentation and say, what went wrong here? What could you know, it might help. So I think the literature, the documentation, even the protocols and things around it are kind of like that. They're psychologically reinforcing, and a teacher is the best thing. Living teacher is the best thing. They're like a coach. You're like the athlete going through the push-ups, right? And jumping the pole vault or whatever you're doing. If you don't do the work, no amount of coaching is going to help. If you don't do the work, no amount of reading is going to help. And if you're not using the app, the documentation doesn't make any sense. So where are we? Are we good? Okay, so now I'm going to quickly read the Bloodstream Sermon, which is one of BohdiDharma's teachings. It's translated by Red Pine, Bloodstream Sermon, who also wrote this book on the Zen teaching of BohdiDharma, which Joseph brought in today. And it's not as long as it seems, because you're not going to read this page. You're just going to read every other page. But Red Pine is Bill Porter, is a wonderful American translator. He's been here several times. We have some big copies of this poster, by the way, that are rolled up in the closet back there. Somebody brought back from China. That's actually a rubbing from a stone. They ink the stone and rub it. And we should probably get them up on the wall. So this is another one to follow up on BohdiDharma. And remember that what we're doing here today is only an introduction to BohdiDharma. There's no way you could begin to comprehend the teaching of any one of these masters in a single session. So it's not meant to do that. This is only meant to pique your interest. And hopefully you will follow up on your own. When you hear somebody that sounds like, I need to follow up on that guy. They didn't have Twitter followers in those days, but they had followers. So this is Bloodstream Sermon. And the bloodstream, by the way, is represented in these documents we fill out as a red line that's running like this. And it goes through big circles, which represent Shakyamuni and BohdiDharma and Dogen and so forth. It comes down, and then all the names are written in black. So it's the bloodline going back. And then it continues, and it goes back to Shakyamuni. So it closes. It doesn't end up at the bottom. It doesn't flesh out at the bottom. It goes back. So everything that appears in the three realms being past, future, and present, and I think there are three other realms that are the formless, the form, and something. Three physical, spatial realms as well as time realms, right? Space-time has always been one thing in Buddhism. Everything that appears in the three realms comes from the mind. Hence, the Buddhas of the past and future teach mind to mind without bothering about definitions. But and there's a question in italics, but if they don't define it, what do they mean by mind? You ask, that's your mind. I answer, that's my mind. So Sensei would say, your enlightenment is yours, mine is mine. You can't get mine, I can't get yours. If I had no mind, how could I answer? If you had no mind, how could you ask? That which asks is your mind. Through endless kalpas without beginning, whatever you do, wherever you are, that's your real mind. That's your real Buddha. This mind is the Buddha, emphasized, says the same thing. Beyond this mind, you'll never find another Buddha. To search for enlightenment or nirvana beyond this mind is impossible. The reality of your own self-nature, the absence of cause and effect, is what's meant by your mind, is what's meant by mind. Your mind is nirvana. You might think you can find a Buddha or enlightenment somewhere beyond the mind, but such a place doesn't exist. Okamura said something funny one time. He said, we all want to go to nirvana. He said, he was here talking. He said, but you go to nirvana, there's nobody there. He said, only bodhisattvas can go to nirvana, and they choose to stay here. So he said, our challenge is to change this samsara into nirvana. Funny. So trying to find a Buddha or enlightenment is trying to grab space. Space has a name, but no form. It's not something you can pick up or put down. And you certainly can't grab it. Beyond this mind, you'll never see a Buddha. The Buddha is a product of your mind. Why look for a Buddha beyond this mind? Buddhas of the past and future only talk about this mind. The Buddha is the Buddha, and the Buddha is the mind. Beyond the mind, there's no Buddha, and beyond the Buddha, there's no mind. If you think there's a Buddha beyond the mind, where is he? There's no Buddha beyond the mind, so why envision one? You can't know your real mind as long as you deceive yourself. As long as you're enthralled by a lifeless form, you're not free. If you don't believe me, deceiving yourself won't help. It's not the Buddha's fault. People, though, are deluded. They're unaware that their own mind is the Buddha. Otherwise, they wouldn't look for a Buddha outside the mind. Buddhas don't save Buddhas. If you use your mind to look for a Buddha, you won't see the Buddha. As long as you look for a Buddha somewhere else, you'll never see that your own mind is the Buddha. Don't use a Buddha to worship a Buddha. And don't use the mind to invoke a Buddha. Buddhas don't recite sutras. Buddhas don't keep precepts. And Buddhas don't break precepts. Buddhas don't keep or break anything. Buddhas don't do good or evil. To find a Buddha, you have to see your nature. Whoever sees this nature is a Buddha. If you don't see your nature, invoking Buddhas, reciting sutras, making offerings, and keeping precepts are all useless. Invoking Buddhas results in good karma. Reciting sutras results in good memory, in a good memory. Keeping precepts results in a good birth. And making offerings results in future blessings, but no Buddha. If you don't understand by yourself, you'll have to find a teacher to get to the bottom of life and death. But unless he sees his nature, such a person isn't a teacher. Even if he can recite the 12-fold canon, he can't escape the wheel of birth and death. He suffers in the 3 realms without hope of release. Long ago, the monk, Good Star, was able to recite the entire canon. But he didn't escape the wheel because he didn't see his nature. If this was the case with Good Star, then people nowadays who recite a few sutras or shastras, which are commentaries, and think it's the Dharma are fools. Unless you see your mind, reciting so much prose is useless. To find a Buddha, all you have to do is see your nature. Your nature is the Buddha. And the Buddha is the person who's free of plans, free of cares. If you don't see your nature and run around all day looking somewhere else, you'll never find a Buddha. The truth is, there's nothing to find. But to reach such an understanding, you need a teacher, and you need to struggle to make yourself understand. Life and death are important. Don't suffer them in vain. There's no advantage in deceiving yourself. Even if you have mountains of jewels and as many servants as there are grains of sands along the Ganges, you see them when your eyes are open. But what about when your eyes are shut? You should realize then that everything you see is like a dream or illusion. Thank you, Dharma-san. I could use a little more tea if anybody. Okay, so that's it. Now let's open up for just questions and answers. We've got 5 minutes, okay. Any newcomers want to weigh in? Jack already has. Thank you, Jack. We encourage dialogue here. It's the only way to clarify the Dharma. Thank you. That's good enough. I always get the leftovers.
That's fun stuff.
Best part. Depends.
Yeah.
Soup. Soup is usually the best. Joseph, you gave a talk on BohdiDharma a few months ago.
Yeah.
Anything you'd like to add?
I have 2 points. The first was that his teacher was a woman.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Anyatara?
Yeah. So, what number was he?
He was 28, so she was 27.
Yes.
And he also had a nun, you may have heard in the story. And that's not uncommon. During Buddha's lifetime, Ananda, his cousin, called for a parliament and pushed for the inclusion of women in the order, and they voted it through. So early on, before Shakyamuni died, in the first 80 years, the order included men and women. And they knew it was going to be more complicated.
I do want to be clear that the women got paid less now.
And in China, the symbol for trouble, 2 women under 1 roof.
Well, it means that he was the 27th patriarch in Zen was actually nature.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Awesome.
When you come right down to it.
Yeah, but Buddha nature is not gendered, so we're androgynous.
The other thing is, I kind of went down the rabbit hole with the Lakavara Sutra, which was BohdiDharma's teacher was like, you need to take this to China. This is all you need, basically. And so I tried to read translations of that, and that's a teaching that the Buddha gave to these flesh-eating demons who demanded They're asked for the teaching. So you can imagine the Buddha is like in this palace of these demons who are like, teach us the Dharma. We don't want to be eating human beings all the time. We just don't know a better way. Figure it out. And at that time, you know, the sutra is like the Heart Sutra. I used to, when we recite the Heart Sutra, drove me crazy. I was like, oh God, 5 minutes of this, you know. But the Lakavara Sutra is like 40,000 lines. And at one point, the Heart Sutra was like 120,000. So there's been this process of distilling it down, all these sutras. And compared to the Heart Sutra, the Lakavara Sutra is very abstruse. But one passage it says, like he says, Buddhists don't recite sutras. The Lakavara Sutra, it says, in Buddha realms there is no language.
There is no
language.
Yes.
People communicate, and it lists all these things, ways they communicate. One of them is shivering. If I want to communicate something instead of saying something, like shivering, you shiver back, you know. And it gives all these different aspects of nonverbal communication. So I think that's what they were trying to get at, is all this language that we use kind of uses us too. And then in the end, I think that's the only thing he really left, was he left this Lakavara Sutra. And I think over the centuries, they thought this is just too complex, and he translated it to the Heart Sutra. But an interesting study of that sutra, and Red Pine has a book on it too.
Yeah, he came here from when he was developing his book on the Heart Sutra, and he gave a talk here about it. And it's true, the Heart Sutra that we chant is kind of like a Reader's Digest, condensed version of all the teachings. And I often remark that if they were links and they were underlined in the blue type, almost every phrase, if you clicked on it, it would bring up a whole other sutra. Yeah. So they're kind of like Indra's net, you know, the microcosm and the macrocosm. It's all just, and the approach in the Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, the sort of prosperity religion that's become, chanting the title, kind of has that implication that if you just chant the title, you're in effect reciting the whole sutra. Now, that begs the question, have you actually studied the sutra? So you know. But there's sort of a mystical implication there tied into the idea of dharani, that gate gate paragate parasamgate bodhisvaha is sort of magical. The sounds themselves are transported. Dharani means something like a vessel. It carries you. So if you knit in the chanting traditions in the history of Buddhism were for people that we know are not going to do meditation. You know, they're too lazy, it's too hard, it's too, whatever, for whatever reason. So they can chant. They can chant while they're working, you can chant all day long, you can chant in traffic jam, you can chant, you know, red light, so on. So you can fit that in around everything else you do. And the idea is that by repetition, by sheer repetition, eventually it will sink in. You'll start to actually see what this means. And that's why, one of the reasons I encourage people to do memorization. If you take some of these shorter ones and memorize them, you'll find that by repeating them, either sub-vocalizing or chanting them out loud when you're driving or whatever, the meaning of what you're saying starts to become apparent to you in almost a magical way. It's not like reading. Okay, anybody else? Beginning of wisdom. Don't get him started. We'll be here all day.
Just gave the example of the priest who shut up was the best one, so now would be one.
Right. He actually said too much. So thank you for your listening and your patience. And let's do the 4 vows. Same thing, 3. And stop at the beginning, 2 on the last line of the last round. We'll go through them 3 times.
We start with 3 bells, and then on the
3
third.
bells and a stop, and then 2 on the very last line. That way everybody knows we're done. Beings are numberless, I vow to freedom, delusions are
ways unsurpassable, I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless, I vow to freedom. Illusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Our gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. The way is unsurpassable, I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless, I vow to freedom. Illusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Our gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. The way is unsurpassable, I vow to realize it.
So next week I'll still be in this spot. I'll be back in this spot with a contemporary teaching. And then the first Sunday following, we'll have a guest speaker who is, and you are speaking on,
The platform sutra.
which is we know,
Yeah.
platform speaker of we know. And then the second Sunday is always our lunch, and second Saturday is all they said. Second Sunday is our lunch as well. We have a lunch on Sunday, sometimes leftovers from Saturday. But it's a chance for us just to have a dialogue as a community. There's nobody. Brian usually comes in and leads, but he facilitates a discussion basically every second Sunday. So if you want a little more clarity on this, the poster is posted above the donation box out there. Go through what we do.